It's one thing to argue about immigration policy. It's one thing to disagree about borders, about enforcement, about who should stay and who should go. Those are political debates. They happen in Congress. They happen on cable news. Sometimes they happen at kitchen tables. It's another thing entirely when a nearly blind man is dropped off 5 miles from home without his family knowing, without his lawyer knowing, in the dead of winter, and days later, he's found dead. That is not a debate about policy. That's a question of humanity. And that's what I want to talk about today. Okay, so the man at the center of this story was a 56-year-old by the name of Nurul Amin Shah Alam. He was a Burmese refugee living in Buffalo, New York. He was legally in the United States. He had a wife, he had 2 sons, and he was nearly blind. And when I say nearly blind, I don't mean he needed glasses. I mean he had severe visual impairment and also limited English proficiency. He navigated the world in a way that already required vulnerability and trust at a great level. Back in 2025, he went for a walk and became disoriented. He had purchased a curtain rod, not as a weapon, but, not to hurt anyone. He was using it as a makeshift walking stick because of his vision problems. A curtain rod. He ended up on someone's porch, accidentally. The homeowner called police. Officers arrived. They told him to drop the curtain rod. According to reports, because of his limited English and impaired vision, he did not immediately comply. The officers tased him, and he was arrested. He was charged with trespass and criminal possession of a weapon, the weapon being that curtain rod. Now, let that sink in. A visually impaired refugee using a curtain rod to help him walk ends up charged with possessing a weapon. Now, to be clear, he ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced misdemeanor charges, criminal possession of a weapon in the 4th degree, and trespass. These were not felonies. Prosecutors reportedly considered his medical condition and the time he had already served, which at that point was months, and they reduced the charges. But here's where it matters. That misdemeanor plea he took, triggered immigration consequences. After posting bail in this February of 2026, instead of simply going home, he was transferred into the custody of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement due to an immigration detainer. He was in custody. And then came the release. After being held, he was released, not to his home, not to his family, not to his attorney. He was dropped off at a Tim Hortons in Buffalo, 5 miles from his house. Now, 5 miles may not seem like much if you have a car or, a good set of eyes, but this man was blind, or nearly blind. It was winter in Buffalo. He did not have family notified. His attorney wasn't notified. There was no coordinated pickup. ICE reportedly described the transport as a courtesy. A courtesy. He was last seen on February 19th. Days passed. His family reported him missing. They had no idea where he had been left. And then his body was found. Local authorities later reported that his death was, quote, health-related, end quote. Exposure and homicide were ruled out. But the fact remains, a nearly blind man dropped off miles from his home with no notice to anyone, ended up dead. Even if the medical examiner says it was health related, we still have to ask the moral question. What responsibility does the government bear when it releases a vulnerable person into the cold with no support? Because this isn't just about one man, it's about a pattern that immigration advocates have reported is far too common. There are documented reports of people being released from ICE detention with nothing but the clothes they were wearing when they were arrested. No coat, no phone, no cash, no arranged transportation, no family notification, oftentimes late at night, and oftentimes in unfamiliar cities. And we need to separate something here. You can believe in immigration enforcement. You can believe the law should be followed. You can believe people should go through proper channels. But none of that requires neglect. None of that requires abandoning people in freezing weather. None of that requires treating human beings as logistical inconveniences instead of lives. And this is where organizations like Haven Watch come in. Haven Watch monitors detention centers and release locations. Volunteers literally watch for people being released so they don't disappear into the cold. They provide coats, they provide transportation, they help people contact family members. They make sure someone who has just been released isn't left wandering alone. Now think about that for a second. A nonprofit exists because there's a pattern of people being released from detention with so little coordination that volunteers have to stand outside to help them. That's not normal. That's not efficient government. That's a humanitarian gap, to say the least. In the case of Nurul Amin Shah Alam, no one was there to catch him. His family didn't know. His lawyer didn't know. He was left to navigate 5 miles in the dead of winter in Buffalo with a severe visual impairment. And days later, he was gone. This is where the bigger issue lives. ICE's mandate is enforcement, but enforcement without basic human safeguards becomes something else entirely. When individuals who are not violent criminals, and let's be clear, misdemeanor trespass and a curtain rod do not make someone a hardened criminal. There is no indication that this gentleman had any criminal record before that arrest. When they are detained and released into dangerous circumstances, that is a systems failure. We are told that enforcement focuses on, quote, the worst of the worst. That phrase gets used constantly, but stories like this and many, many others undercut that narrative. This was not a cartel leader. This was not a gang member. This was not a dangerous felon in any way. This was a visually impaired refugee who got lost and ended up on the wrong porch. And the way he was handled should concern anyone, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. If you're conservative and believe in personal responsibility, then surely the government should also be responsible for how it handles vulnerable people in custody. If you're progressive and believe in human rights, this story reinforces why oversight matters. And if you're somewhere in the middle, just, trying to live your life, here's the simple question. If this were your father or your uncle or your neighbor, would you be okay with how this unfolded? Detention is already a severe measure. People in ICE custody have been describing poor medical care, long waits, confusion about release times, and limited communication with family. Reports over the months have detailed cases of people being discharged without adequate coordination, even in cold weather states. And here's the thing that should unsettle everyone. Once someone is in government custody, they are completely dependent on that system. They don't control when they're released. They don't control where they're transported. They don't control whether someone calls their family. The power imbalance is total. And with total power comes total responsibility. Dropping someone off 5 miles from home in winter conditions without notifying anybody may not violate a specific written statute, but it violates the basic duty of care. Now, there'll be people who say, well, he shouldn't have pleaded guilty, or he shouldn't have wandered onto someone's porch, or, he broke the law. But proportionality matters. Justice isn't supposed to be a domino effect that escalates a minor mistake into life-altering outcomes. I mean, keep in mind now, we're talking about people who are released. So we have to assume that in most, if not all cases, they have been found to not be guilty of anything, even immigration offenses, or else they wouldn't have been released. And in this gentleman's case, surely a curtain rod used as a walking stick should not become the first chapter in a chain of events that ends in the morgue. And yet here we are. The tragedy here is not just the death itself. It's the preventability of that death. If his family had been notified, they could have come and picked him up. If his attorney had been notified, he could have made arrangements. If release protocols required coordination for all detainees, let alone vulnerable detainees, he wouldn't have been alone. If a coat had been provided, he might still be alive. If transportation had been arranged to his doorstep. If. We are a country that debates immigration fiercely, and I guess that's fair, but there's a difference between enforcement and indifference. When stories like this emerge, they test who we are. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Systems don't become more humane on their own. They require scrutiny. They require attention. They require outrage. ICE rounding up individuals who are clearly not hardened criminals is controversial enough. But when you layer on reports of people being released in the way this gentleman was released, without coats, without notice to family, without any coordination, it becomes more than controversial. It becomes enraging. And it should be enraging. And not because of politics, but because of basic human standards. A nation can enforce its laws and still treat people with basic dignity. A government can detain someone and still ensure that they get home safely upon release. Those two things are not exclusive. Nurul Amin Shah Alam deserved better than a Tim Hortons parking lot 5 miles from home. He deserved a phone call. He deserved some level of coordination for his release. He deserved care. And whether you see this as a policy failure or an oversight, lack of compassion or bureaucracy, whatever, it's a failure. And we can't normalize this, because once we normalize vulnerable people disappearing into the cold after government release, we've crossed a line. And that line shouldn't be partisan. It's human. That's the story. And it's one I truly hope that we remember longer than a news cycle. All right, everyone. That brings another installment of Back Porch Files to a close. I thank you once again for taking the time to download and listen to this particular episode. I encourage you to go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheLeft.com. There's lots of things to find there, including blog posts that mirror the topics covered in various episodes. There is a contacts page where you can find all the links to the social media for the podcast, as well as the email address. And I would love to hear from any of you, whether it's through DMs on the social media apps or through an email, to let me know what you think of the podcast and give your feedback in general. There's also a web player page on the website where you can listen to or download any of the episodes of the podcast, including this one. So I'll be back on Tuesday with another full episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. And between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.